Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's expert webinar titled Excel Macros and VBA. I am Ria from SpringPeople. We are India's largest enterprise training provider, and I will be your moderator for today's session. In today's session, we have Pallavi Prasad with us, an accomplished corporate trainer passionate about bridging the gap between technology and business. With over 500 successful training sessions delivered, she has earned recognition as a trusted expert in her field. Pallavi is laser-focused expertise in C with data structures, OOPS concepts, C++, VC++, multi-threading, core Java, JEE, Spring Hibernate, Unix, Linux, shell scripting, .NET Framework 3.5, CVB.NET, ASP.NET, ADO.NET, JavaScript, PhoneGap, Cordova, RPA, Automation Anywhere, UiPath, AngularJS, to name a few. Pallavi Prasad's commitment to delivering timely and effective training has consistently added value to organizations, ensuring that participants are well equipped to apply their knowledge effectively in real-world settings. In today's webinar, Pallavi Prasad will inform us about introduction to macros, recording a macro, advantages and disadvantages of recording a macro, different ways of executing a macro, and a brief look at the VBA editor, a quick look at writing a VBA producer or macro. To all the participants, you can mention your questions in the chat box and it will be answered at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, let's start today's session. I would like to invite Mrs. Pallavi Prasad to start the session. Over to you, Pallavi.
Thank you, Ria. And good evening, everyone. So the topic for today's webinar happens to be Excel Macros and VBA. Let's quickly have a look at the agenda and then we can move on further. So as Ria has mentioned, these are the various topics that we are quickly going to cover today. Sorry. Right. So first and foremost, what is a macro and how are we going to work with it? I'm hoping that I'm audible to everybody. Yeah. So when we are talking about automation, one of the first things that comes to mind is how are you going to automate anything at all? And what is the point of automating something at all? Now, there are times when you have a lot of repetitive tasks that you perform on a day in and day out basis, which takes a lot of time. For example, you're trying to create a pivot table every time for the new data that is coming in, or you have some other task that you want to perform and it happens every day repetitively, and it is a time consuming process. So one of the options that is given to us is when we are going to be able to work with macros in case of Excel. So what is this macro all about? Macro is nothing more than a set of instructions that you're going to use. And these instructions are used to automate any process that needs to be executed on a repetitive basis daily. So what is the necessity for us to work with a macro? Well, one of the best parts about writing a macro is it very rarely fails. The second most important thing about working with a macro is that it saves on time, because what you would normally take, let us assume an hour maybe to finish the task, the macro could probably finish it in a few minutes. The third thing about working with macros is that usually macro is progressive. That means it can be adapted to work with the earlier version of Excel that you're working on. So yes, there may be a few changes that need to be made, but overall, the macro is going to work beautifully. Now, when you're going to plan on creating a macro, there are two ways to create a macro. So as I said, macros are basically a set of instructions. So either you record the instruction or write the instructions. So if you plan on recording the instructions, we need to make use of what is known as a macro recorder that is available to us in our Excel forms. The second way is for us to be able to get into the VBA IDE. So what is this VBA that we are talking about? VBA essentially stands for Visual Basic for Applications. So this is essentially the code behind the scenes, or what actually works behind the scenes whenever you're going to work with macros. So let us start when we work with the VBA editor. So how do you activate this VBA editor? How do you get into the VBA editor? Well, there are three ways of doing this. Let me do one thing. Let me switch over into an Excel sheet that I have open, and I will show you how we can work with this. So this is an Excel sheet that I have. Don't worry about the content that you're happening to see on the screen. We will be working with this. We will see what we can do with all of this. Now, if I want to be able to access VBA, the VBA editor, how am I going to do that? Is we can go to View. This is the first method. We can go to View and we can go to Macros. In Macros, you're going to select View Macros. Pick a macro that you have written, any macro of your choice, whatever you have recorded as of now, and click on Edit. Now this activates a window in the background. This window happens to be called your VBA editor. This is the IDE that we use when we write macro code. All the recorded macros are also stored inside this particular location, inside your inside your Excel workbook itself. The second way of getting into that place or into that VBA editor is if you're going to go and activate your developer tab. So you need to go to File and go to Options. Under Options, you have Customize ribbon. In this, all you have to do is select this tab. It is going to activate what is known as your developer tab. When you click on OK, you will find that a new tab has been added called the developer tab. This will take you into the VB Visual Basic editor just like that. So there are two ways in which you can activate this particular Visual Basic editor. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Moving back. So as I said, there are two ways in which you can work with macros. One is when you're recording it. The second method is when you're going to write the macro. So first, let us look at how we can record a macro. So the steps are given here. So I'll just take you through recording the macro as well, so that we can have a look at what needs to be done. So now I'm going back into that Excel sheet that we have kept open. Now, whenever you're going to work with Excel and you're going to write a macro and you save the workbook, you have to keep in mind that this particular workbook has to be macro enabled. So when you click on, let me do one thing. Let me take an empty workbook that I have, another workbook that I have. This is an Excel SX workbook. So if I record a macro in this particular workbook and I am going to save the workbook, then whatever I save in the workbook, it is automatically going to be saved as an Excel SX book. But when we are going to be using the macros that we are going to record inside the book, then it is going to have to become an Excel SM or a macro enabled workbook. So first, let us start by recording a macro. So I'm going to start recording the macro. To record a macro, there are two ways of doing it. You can use shortcut keys as well, but you can use this particular method as well. This is the easier one of the lot. When you click on View, go to Macros, you have an option which says Record a Macro. You can just click on Record a Macro. It asks you for a name for the macro. Please provide it with a name. So I'm going to call this as my demo macro. It asks you for a shortcut key. So do remember, Control is usually combined with a lot of other keys that we have. So you can try putting in a shift and another character of your choice. So Control Shift and D will run this particular macro workbook for you. Next, where are you going to store the macro? You're going to store the macro in a particular location. There are 3 locations where you can store the macro. One is in this current workbook itself, or you can create a separate workbook which is going to store your macros for you, or third, the personal macro workbook. Currently, I would recommend the current workbook itself. So I'm saving it in this workbook itself. This is one way of recording. Another way of recording a macro is right at the bottom of the screen where my cursor is pointing at present. You will notice that there is a recording button that is here. You click on it, you come to the same screen that I'm showing you at present. Now when I click on OK, my macro starts recording. So whatever I do now, my macro is going to be recording each and every click that I perform. Now, for example, let us say I'm adding a new sheet and I'm going to go and add a header. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to merge and center. I'll call this as my header, and let's increase the font of this. Okay, now let's say I'm underlining it. Let's give it a background color. You want to, you can change the text color as well. Now this is what I want. Now I'm done with my work. I want to stop my macro. So again, 2 ways of stopping it. You go here and click on stop, or you can go to view and click on stop, or you can do it through the developer tab as well. So I'm going to click on stop here. Now my macro is ready. I need to test if my macro is running. So all we do is Control Shift D. My macro has to have created it. It takes far less time for my macro to run than it took for me to actually record my macro. This is one way of working with a macro or creating a macro. Now, the second method is for us to be writing it in a Visual Studio, sorry, in my Visual Basic for Applications IDE, the back end of everything. When you're working with your Visual Basic for Applications or the VBA IDE, there are a few steps that we have to follow. And that is, you need to first and foremost activate your VBE, as we have already done through the developer tab. The second one is that it's when you open the IDE, it shows you a list of all the various modules that are already existing, the various where all the macros are that you have already created. So everything is going to be available to you, shown to you on the screen for you. Whenever you write a macro, you have to keep in mind that your macros, if you want the macros to be available across all the worksheets that you have within your Excel workbook, then make sure that it is available to you in the module. If you want it for a particular sheet, then you can put a macro inside the sheet of a particular workbook as well. Not a recommended way, but yes, there may be instances where you would require that. That is, those are the 2 locations where you can store your workbook, sorry, your macro in your workbook. Putting it in a module is the preferred way of working. So let us have a look at what VBA stands for. This is a quick look at what VBA stands for. This is Visual Basic for Applications, as I've already told you. This particular language is based on your Visual Basic, which is a scripting language that we have. This is similar to the way your JavaScript is written. The difference here is that the way, I mean, this is for MS Office that we are working with, whereas the scripting language that we write, which is JavaScript, is usually browser dependent. Now, when you look at a Visual Basic IDE, there are 3 main windows that we look at. This is the basic look of a Visual Basic IDE. So here, as you can see, this is called the project window, where you notice the various content that is there. So this becomes your project window. All the books that are currently open, and yes, A Visual Basic is opened once for all the books that you have available. All the XLS books that you have kept open, Excel sheets, doesn't matter if they are macro enabled or not, they will be visible to you inside your project, the project window, all the books. Okay, everything will be shown to you. Then the second thing about the project window is it also shows you the various modules or any forms or any macros that you might have written. Everything is going to be visible to you in the project window. The second window is called the properties window. This particular properties window is where you can access the various properties of a worksheet. Now your Visual Basic for applications or VBA is basically object based. That means it looks at everything in Excel as an object. So because it looks at everything as an object, that means these are all going to have their own respective properties and methods associated with them. So if you look at a particular worksheet, a worksheet has properties like, as you can see, name. Then it also has properties like, so that you can see there are two types of names here. There is a name in brackets and there is just one name. Then one in brackets is how Excel recognizes it, by the way. And the one with name is how VBE recognizes it. So it's preferable that you have a matching name in both the places. It also shows you what are all, if you have filters available, etc., all the various properties that are associated with the complete Excel workbook. Explicit worksheets and the workbooks, their respective properties in this particular window. The third window and the most important window, you can say, is the code window. This is where we write most of our code, as you know. So any code that you write, anything at all, you can write it here and you can execute it directly from Excel. You don't have to come into the IDE to be able to execute any of the macros that you have written. Make sure that they have been seen in the macros window when you are going to click on view macros. That's it. You have to select the one that you want to work with and run it. Now, when you're running it, you may come across certain problems with the macro. In such cases, you may have to come back and debug the macro. So we do have one more window that I have not mentioned it in the slides, and that is your watch window. So there is a watch window or an immediate window that is available to you as well as a debugging tool, which allows you to set up the various watches on the various variables that you're going to create. This ensures that you can track what's happening if a particular macro fails. Now, some of the vocabulary, some of the VBA words that we use, I have just listed some of them here for you. We write everything as sub procedures. The sub procedures that we write are given another name and they are called as macros. So any sub procedure you write starts with a sub and ends with an end sub. So that is considered to be one sub procedure. Anything you write between those two becomes a macro for you. Now it's called a macro through Excel, but in our VBA, we call it as a procedure. And a property is any attribute for a particular object, we are going to call it as a property. So when you talk about a sub procedure, as I said, it is another name that we have for a macro that we are going to be working with. Starts with the sub, ends with the sub. Other than a sub procedure, you can write your own user-defined functions which allow you to make a particular object behave the way you would like it to behave. So how does VBA work and what does it do? So whenever you're going to work with a VBA, you are going to, whatever you record or write, you put it into the VBA part of your code, and that's where you're going to be having a look at it for debugging and everything. So that is basically what runs the show for you. Whenever I write a module or whenever I work with a procedure, I have to put it in a module. This makes sure that that particular procedure is accessible throughout my workbook. no problem there at all. So whenever you're going to work with VBA, there are a few things that we have to remember. One of them is that all the objects are arranged in a hierarchy and they can add as containers to other objects. Let's take, for example, a workbook. A workbook has a lot of sheets, worksheets inside it. Inside those worksheets, I have access to rows and columns. I have access to ranges. I have access to filters and various other parts of Excel that I want to work with. Like I can also look at formatting as well. I can look at inserting shapes as well. So you can take that as an example. So the application Excel has workbooks. Each workbook has worksheets. Worksheets have ranges. Ranges have cells, and so on and so forth. Now, let's assume that you haven't given the worksheet name or the workbook name. Then it takes the active workbook or the active worksheet, which is, and they work with that. Now, there is a problem with that particular situation. And the issue is that when you take something that is active, that may not be the one that you want to work with. So ensure that when you're working with VBA, you make a mention of what it is that you want to work with. Working with macros is, I mean, to put it very clearly, the macros are a godsend for Excel actually, because there are so many things that Excel can't do for us on its own. So there may be all those extra things that you want to make Excel do for you. You can do all of that using a simple macro. You can write the macro, you can record the macro, but yes, Excel will perform it without any mistake, repetitively, without feeling bad as well. So that's the most best part of it, because as you know, consistency is really a good thing. Well, in most cases though. So when you're working with Excel, you can get it to do any kind of task that you want to do without errors as well. There is excellent exception handling also available to you when you work with VBA. So yes, you can handle issues as well when you're working with EBA. So VBA, in case there is any issue, you can sort it out by adding exception handlers in the middle or error handlers in the middle, ensuring that the code executes successfully. So even if, let us say that I'm a newbie to Excel and I have been asked to perform a particular task, they have told me there's a macro embedded in it. So I can do the same job, just run the macro without, even if I don't know how to write the macro. Even if I don't know how to record the macro, I can run a macro and get it to perform the task for me perfectly. Okay, so any long time consuming jobs, so everything, these are all the advantages of working with macros. But anything that has a good things to it will probably have some bad things also associated with it. So anything with the pro has cons. One of the first things is you have to learn how to write these programs in VBA. Recording a macro is fine. I mean, it's absolutely fine when these recordings are generic. But if you want it to perform something more specific, say, for example, I want it to create a pivot chart for me on new data that is coming in every day. So first thing I need to do is extract the data, then format the data, and then create the pivot chart. Now, this is something that I have to do on a day in and day out basis. I can't record this. I have to write it, because usually the view that we are showing in the pivot chart may be something that is unique to that particular product, maybe, or that particular financial quarter, maybe, whatever may be the setup. So you can't get Excel macros to record this for you. You have to be able to write it in. One more thing is that when you work with VBA, you should have Excel on the target systems as well. And there is no guarantee that it's an automation tool. It is a software. So when we can make mistakes, it can fail as well. So we have to be very clear about what we are writing. We should have quite good documentation available to ensure that in case something fails, it can be troubleshooted. I mean, the troubleshooting can go through without any major changes to the code. Debugging, if you become a VBA developer, debugging becomes your best friend, or a debugger becomes your best friend. So one more thing about VBA is that it is a moving target. As I already told you, Microsoft keeps on upgrading Excel. So sometimes it so happens that the code that you have written may not work with the earlier versions. It's been known to happen that it's a 50-50 chance that the VBA code that you've written for the current version will not work with the older version properly or with any future version properly. It's been known to happen as well. So there are fine tunings that we actually work with and get it to work. But yes, you have to be able to fix all of that by learning how to write VBA code. And now for what it's things that we have been waiting for. Now what I want is to be able to write a small macro. Instead of recording the macro, I showed you the recording. Now I want to be able to write a macro. And how am I going to write this particular macro? Before writing the macro, I want to be able to save my Excel workbook. So how am I going to do that? So as I showed you, I have two workbooks. I will write a macro, but I will show you a recorded macro. I'm sorry, a written macro as well as the modules that we have as well. So let's switch over into Excel. Let me open the Visual Studio, Visual Basic. Now you will notice that everything that I have is a module. So these are the windows that we were talking about earlier. This is your project window. This is your properties window. And this is your code window, where my cursor is currently the larger window. That is your code window. Now, whenever you're going to work with your macros, you will notice that every workbook that you have kept open is shown in a single Visual Basic editor. It doesn't open an independent editor for every workbook that you have. It opens a single editor with the workbooks that are there. If you close all the workbooks, then automatically the editor also will close. So if you open this second one, the sample workbook, in which we had recorded the macro, you will notice that it has added something called as modules, and there is a module 1 under it. If I double click on it, this is the macro that we had actually worked with. We recorded this particular macro. And whatever got recorded, you will notice that the keyboard shortcut key has also come here. Another thing is you can add the description for the macro. You can add some detailing to the macro here in your VBE as well. Reason being that, I mean, you want to be able to have some kind of documentation for whatever macros you write. Now you will notice that this starts with a sub and ends with an end sub. So that means within this is the macro, and within the sub and end sub is my sub procedure as well. You can call it a procedure, you can call it a sub procedure. Both of them literally mean the same thing. So you will notice people saying that I'm writing a macro, or I'm writing a procedure or a sub procedure. They mean the same thing. Now I want to show you a written macro for creating a pivot table. Now one more thing you will notice is that there are a lot of sheets available. Whenever a sheet is available, you will notice that there are a lot of properties here that you can see. You can change the names. So this is a different name, and you can notice this is a different name internally. The way it is accessed is different. So please remember to give them the same names. It would really be a helpful way of handling content. Now, whatever is in the bracket is something that is accessed through VBA, and this is through your Excel sheets. So it's called sheet. So you take anything at all. See, it says example database. Now I have a sheet called as example database in my workbook. Now let's have a look at the modules. One of the most useful modules that I have worked with is this particular module for being able to create a pivot chart and a pivot table. I'm closing this. And now I want to be able to create a pivot chart or a pivot table. You will notice that everything is available to you here for me to be able to create a pivot table. Now let us see if I can actually create a pivot table. I have already written the code here. I'm not going to be explaining the code. I'll just show you that this is how easy it is to run and write a pivot table. Now this was written for an earlier version of Excel, so it may fall flat, but I am confident that this should work because it is generic code. Now let's see if it works. And see, it asks, do you want a pivot chart? If I cancel, it doesn't create a pivot chart, but it's created the pivot table. Can you notice the pivot table that's been created here? This pivot table was not there earlier. If you want, I delete it. This I'm deleting. Now the data that was used in that comes from this particular sheet. So this is the data that I have. Let us say that I've brought this data from somewhere. I want to create a pivot chart from this. So for me to create a pivot chart, I have to start by inserting a new sheet, and then I have to go to data here. I have to pick up how to create a pivot chart. Then I have to set up the necessary content. Everything I have to do, I have to insert the pivot chart. I have to add the ranges, etc., etc. Everything I have to do. Now, I don't want to take the trouble of doing all that. I want it done like that within a short minute. So you can do it by just going and running it from there. Now the problem here is that not everybody will have access to the VBE. I mean, you can run it by going and running it from the VBE. The second way of executing it would be if you go to View and Macros, click on View Macros and select what you want to work with. So I want to be able to work with this particular macro called as create pivot. I can run it. And it's created the pivot chart. You can see the sheet has been created here. Now I don't want this either. I don't want to go and pick it up from a range of macros. Instead, what you can do is you can add a simple button. I'm sorry about that. So you can try to add a button and have a look at it, see how you can work with it. But to add a button or anything of that sort, you will need your developer tab for that. But these can be kept ready and then shared with somebody. So I'm just creating a form control, dropping it. I just give a name to the button. Before I give a name to the button, I need to allocate a macro to it. So I'm allocating a macro or assigning a macro to it. Now my button is ready. Let's click on the button. Let us say I want to create a macro. So let's say I'll just say create pivot. I'm done with my button. It does the same job for me. This is another way in which you can ensure that your code runs. So you will notice that the data is, the pivot table is getting created time and time again. You can change the way it works as well. You can alter the way it works by adding a few things to it. So this is something that I wanted you all to have a look. Now there is one more thing that I think we can work with. Now you've heard of advanced filters. I'm assuming that all of you have heard of advanced filters. Now what I want is to be able to write an advanced filter for my example worksheet. So that's what I'm going to do next. So I have already got a model here. So inside this module, I'm going to write a second macro. Let's call this as an advanced filter. Now let us start with a sub. I'll write a method. I'll call this as get data, and it will add the end data automatically. you can have a look at it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this and put this in the beginning. So how are we going to work with it? The first thing that we need is for us to be able to have a worksheet. So let us create or declare a worksheet. So I'm going to use WS as. So you can see for yourself how it is coming up. I'm not doing much. Second thing, I need a flag. I'm setting this up as a Boolean. So you can have a look at it. It's actually writing part of the code for me. So the first thing that I need is to be able to extract a range from my code. So I'm going to extract the range. So let us say before that, which is the workbook, the worksheet that I'm going to be working with. That I want to check to see if that worksheet exists. If it exists, I want to be able to activate that particular worksheet because that's the one from which I want to work. Okay, so we will activate the worksheet. We will just set it up as worksheets. So let's say set WS equal to, I want to be able to set it up to a particular worksheet. So let us say worksheets. And let's give the name of the worksheet. The name of the worksheet is example database. Make sure that your spellings are correct. Then ws.activate. So I'm basically activating my worksheet. So this is how you start writing it. Once you've activated the worksheet, then you're going to do the rest of the things. Now, if you go to your sample workbook, let's go to your example, this one. So what I basically want is, I want to select a vertical from here. This is the data that I have. If you look at it, this is the data that I have. I want to pull out this particular data from here onwards, and using an advanced filter, I want to put it somewhere else. Let us say I want to put it in this particular location. Somewhere else it has to store it. Once it has extracted, what I want to do. So let's write the first part of it. When we are working with VBA, this is how we start writing the code. So I think I need to close this. Give me a minute. Yes. Let's write it here. Now, the next step is for me to start by selecting the range. When I'm working with I have to give the range. So let us start by providing the range, which is A5 to, is it A5 or A7? Make sure you have your ranges correctly. So the range is from A7. It is not from A5. It is from A7 to, you will have to look at it, it is P87. Please keep a note of it because this is important. It will have to pull out that particular range. Now this becomes my range, and this is going to be the selection that I want to work with. So you have something called advanced filter that you can work with. So advanced filter space action. What is the action you want to give it? I want to filter copy. I don't want to filter in place. So I'll just say filter copy. So let us set the action. If you're not comfortable with the way this is doing, you can write it like this as well. Action : equal to, and you can set the value. Next, you need to give it the criteria range. So make sure that you provide the criteria range. Again, the criteria range is equal to, please mention what is going to be the range that you're going to be working with. So you have to put everything in this particular way, where you mention the name of your workbook, and then you're going to have to give the criteria. So where are you going to get the criteria from? You have to name that particular cell as your criteria cell. So now, if I go back to my sample workbook, these two cells become my criteria. These two cells will become the criteria. So name them as criteria, name this range as criteria. You know how to do that. Name the range as criteria. Once you have named the range as criteria, or if you're not sure about the criteria, please provide the actual ranges. When to be working with. So it should be these two. You can give it as a set range. So you can provide it with a set range. So you can say it should be from what was the range set? You can say from B3 and B4. So B3 to B4, you can set it up. So you can do this. So you have set the criteria range. The next thing that you have to specify is where it has to copy. So copy to range. Mention the location you want to copy it to. So you can say range and specify where it has to copy to. So I'm going to give it as S7 and we'll get it to work. You also want to ensure that you get only unique values. So you're going to mention unique. Let me put it in the next line. It seems, okay, sorry, my mistake. Give me a minute. Since it's a single one, I have to give an underscore so that it understands that it's going into the next line. So unique equal to set it to true. Okay, so this is the first part of what you want. So your advanced filter will run based on this. Once it is, you can copy paste it and work with it further. So just starting. Now let's see if this works and this much gets us what we want it to happen. So I'm just going to select get data. Let's click on run. There seems to be a problem. Can you make out? There seems to be a problem. What is the problem that you're working with? You have to check out why it is giving an issue. So now we can bring in the debugger. The problem is that I can't see the breakpoint. I can't see the debug window. I can't see anything here, but I want to set up all of that. So for all of that, we need to use what we call as the edit window. So we need the edit window to be available to us, the edit toolbar to be available to us. So what we are going to do is we'll go to view and you have an option for toolbars. Just check the edit toolbar and anchor it. Now you have whatever is necessary. You can have your breakpoints, you can set up your watch windows, your immediates and everything. So I'm not going to debug it at present, it will take some time. So I'm just going to leave this here. And this is all I was planning on covering for this particular webinar. So thank you everybody for your time and your patience here. Now, one more thing is, Ria, over to you.
Thank you, Pallavi, for your invaluable insights on technology. I'm sure it was certainly a very informative session for all of you. If you guys are interested in learning more about the Excel Macros and VBA course, do check out our super discounted batches of virtual instructor LED trainings on our website, springpeople.com. These VILT trainings are leveraged online from the comforts of your home and flexible as per your schedule and location. If you do not find any suitable batches, we'd be happy to discuss and schedule private batches for you. If you don't have time to join live online, then do try out our affordable self-paced courses. For more information, do write to us at training@springpeople.com or call on our number displayed on the current slide. All right, thank you again, Pallavi, and thank you everyone. We appreciate you being here. We shall be sending out the webinar recording to all the participants soon. I request you to kindly provide feedback before signing off, which will help us improve the quality of our future events. Thanks again for joining us today. Signing off on behalf of Team Spring People. Hope to see you again for our next expert webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.